March 17, 1943, the North Atlantic, 280 miles southwest of Iceland. The water is black and restless, churned by winds that scream across the surface like wounded animals. Aboard the German submarine U-632, the air inside the pressure hull tastes of diesel oil, unwashed bodies, and fear. 46 men breathe the same recycled oxygen, their lungs pulling from an atmosphere so thick with moisture that condensation drips from the steel bulkheads, like sweat from a dying man's brow. Captain Lieutenant Hans Karpeff stands hunched in the control room, his eyes fixed on the depth gauge as the boat slips deeper into the grey void. The only sounds are the rhythmic ping of the sonar, the hum of electric motors, and the metallic groan of the hull, compressing under the weight of the ocean. In his hand, folded and refolded until the creases have worn thin, is a single sheet of paper, a weather report, routine, mundane, transmitted 3 hours earlier, on a frequency that should have been secure. He does not yet know that this slip of paper, this fragment of meteorological data encoded in a cipher the crew believed unbreakable, has already been intercepted, decoded, and analyzed by Allied intelligence officers sitting in a concrete bunker thousands of miles away. He does not know that embedded within the transmission's preamble, a single error, a procedural deviation so small it could be measured in seconds, has torn open a window into one of the most closely guarded secrets of the Third Reich. The mistake was not in the message itself, but in the rhythm of its sending. A radio operator, exhausted after 18 hours on duty, had transmitted the weather report using a slightly different call sign sequence than protocol demanded. It was a deviation of 3 characters. 3 characters in a war where millions would die. But those 3 characters, cross-referenced with direction finding, intercepts, and traffic analysis, would lead Allied codebreakers not to a submarine, but to something far more valuable: the location of a hidden German weather station in the Arctic, a facility so secret that its existence had been systematically erased from official records. A base whose discovery would reshape the intelligence war and expose the vast and fragile infrastructure that Hitler's navy had constructed across the frozen edge of the world. The war in the Atlantic was not merely a contest of torpedoes and depth charges. It was a war of information, fought in silence, waged by men who never fired a shot. By the spring of 1943, the Battle of the Atlantic had reached its crescendo. German U-boats, operating in coordinated wolf packs, had sunk over 2,400 Allied merchant vessels since the war's beginning, sending more than 14 million tons of shipping to the seafloor. The convoys that sustained Britain's slow, vulnerable columns of freighters laden with oil, grain, steel, and ammunition crossed an ocean that had become a graveyard. For every 100 ships that sailed, a dozen would never reach port. The men who sailed them knew the odds. They knew the sound a torpedo made as it cut through the water, the way a ship's hull buckled inward when the warhead detonated against the keel, the terrible speed with which a vessel could vanish beneath the surface, taking its crew down into the cold and the dark, where no one would ever find them. The U-boat crews, in turn, lived in a mechanical underworld of their own. Submarines of the Type 7 class were marvels of engineering and instruments of claustrophobia. 220 feet long, 20 feet wide, crewed by men who slept in shifts because there were never enough bunks. The air was foul, the food rotted, and the sea was always waiting, patient, indifferent, absolute. But the U-boats had one advantage that mattered more than speed or firepower. They knew where the convoys were. German naval intelligence, through a combination of radio intercepts, reconnaissance aircraft, and a sophisticated network of weather stations, could predict the routes the Allies would take, the conditions they would face, the windows of opportunity when fog or storm would render air cover ineffective. Weather, in the North Atlantic, was not merely an environmental factor, it was a weapon, and to wield it, Germany needed data from the Arctic. The Arctic, in 1943, was a void on the map, vast, uninhabited, hostile to human life. It was a place where winter darkness lasted for months, where temperatures plunged to 40 below zero, where pack ice could crush a ship's hull like an eggshell. It was also the key to controlling the North Atlantic. Meteorological conditions in the Arctic determined weather patterns across the entire northern hemisphere. Storms born in the frozen seas above Norway would sweep south and east, shaping visibility, wind speed, sea state, all the variables that meant life or death for submarines and convoys alike. Whoever controlled the weather data controlled the battle space. The Allies knew this, the Germans knew this, and so, in the barren archipelagos and ice-choked fjords of the far north. Both sides established covert weather stations, tiny outposts manned by skeleton crews whose sole purpose was to observe, record, and transmit meteorological data back to command. These stations were not marked on any map. Their locations were classified at the highest levels. The men who staffed them lived in conditions of near-total isolation, enduring months of darkness, cold, and monotony, knowing that if they were discovered, no rescue would come. They were expendable, but the intelligence they provided was not. The German weather station network stretched from Svalbard to Greenland, from Jan Mayen Island to the eastern coast of Labrador. Some stations were automated, unmanned installations that transmitted data at fixed intervals. Others were staffed by small teams of meteorologists, radio operators, and soldiers tasked with defending the facility, should it ever be found. The largest and most strategically important of these stations was codenamed Houdegen. Located on Nord-Auslandet, a desolate island in the Svalbard archipelago, Houdegen was a marvel of covert logistics. Supplied by submarine and flying boat, it operated continuously from 1944 until the war's end, transmitting weather data that informed U-boat deployments, surface fleet movements, and Luftwaffe operations across the North Atlantic. But Houdegen, for all its importance, was discovered only after the war had ended. The station that the Allies found in March 1943 was smaller, more vulnerable, and ultimately more revealing. It was called Weather Station Kurt, and it was not in the Arctic at all. It was in Newfoundland, on the coast of Labrador, in North America, on Allied soil. Weather Station Kurt was the product of desperation and audacity in equal measure. By the autumn of 1943, the German Navy's weather intelligence network was under strain. Allied air patrols and naval forces had made resupply missions to Arctic stations increasingly dangerous. Several installations had been discovered and destroyed. The meteorological data streaming back to Berlin was incomplete, inconsistent, delayed. Admiral Karl Dönitz, commander of the U-boat fleet, understood that without reliable weather forecasts, his submarines were operating blind. Convoys could slip through gaps in patrol lines. Storms could catch boats on the surface, making them vulnerable to air attack. The entire operational tempo of the Atlantic campaign depended on knowing what the weather would do 3 days, 5 days, a week in advance. And so, in the late summer of 1943, the German Navy conceived an operation so brazen that it bordered on the absurd. They would establish a covert weather station not in the Arctic, but on the coast of North America itself. The target location was Martin Bay, a remote and uninhabited stretch of coastline in northern Labrador. It was a place so isolated that no human settlements existed within 100 miles. The terrain was rock, tundra, and ice. No roads led there, no ships visited. It was, in the estimation of German planners, the perfect location for a clandestine installation. The plan was simple. A submarine would transport the equipment and personnel to the site. The team would go ashore, establish the station, camouflage it, and activate the automated transmitters. The station would broadcast weather data on a continuous loop, disguised to appear as though it were originating from a Canadian meteorological service. The submarine would return to base. The station would operate undetected for months, perhaps years, feeding intelligence directly into the heart of the U-boat command network. The operation was codenamed Kurt. On October 22, 1943, the German submarine U-537, under the command of Kapitänleutnant Peter Schrew, departed from Kiel carrying the components of Weather Station Kurt in watertight canisters. The crew had been told nothing about the mission's true nature. They knew only that they were bound for North American waters, and that secrecy was paramount. U-537 crossed the Atlantic submerged, surfacing only at night to recharge batteries and refresh the air. The passage took 18 days. On the night of November 9th, the submarine reached the coast of Labrador and approached Martin Bay under cover of darkness. The weather was bitter, the wind howling off the pack ice. The crew assembled on deck, hauling the canisters up through the forward hatch and loading them onto inflatable rafts. The meteorological equipment, barometers, anemometers, temperature sensors, radio transmitters, batteries, and antennae was heavy, cumbersome, designed for durability rather than portability. The shore party consisted of 4 men, 2 meteorologists, a radio operator, and an armed guard. They rowed ashore through surf that crashed against the rocks like artillery fire, dragged the equipment up the beach, and established the station on a low ridge overlooking the bay. The installation took less than 6 hours. The transmitters were calibrated, the antennae erected, the power supply connected. The station was camouflaged with rocks and brush, made to look like a natural feature of the landscape. To further disguise its origin, the canisters were marked with counterfeit labels identifying them as property of the Canadian Weather Service. It was a crude deception, but effective. If the station were discovered, the hope was that it would be mistaken for a forgotten Allied installation, abandoned and inoperative. By dawn, the work was complete. The shore party returned to the submarine. U-537 slipped back beneath the surface and began the long journey home, where the station Kurt began transmitting on November 10, 1943. Its signals, disguised as routine Canadian meteorological broadcasts, were received and decoded by German naval intelligence. For weeks, the station provided accurate and timely weather data. It was a triumph of covert operations, an intelligence coup that validated the risk of placing an installation on enemy soil. And then, in early March 1943, a mistake was made, not at weather station Kurt, but aboard U-632, a submarine operating in the mid-Atlantic. The error was procedural, trivial. A radio operator, fatigued and overworked, transmitted a weather report using a call sign that deviated from standard protocol. The deviation was 3 characters. The message itself was encrypted using the Enigma cipher, which the Germans believed to be unbreakable. The message was routine: wind speed, barometric pressure, sea state, visibility. Nothing of tactical value, nothing that would suggest the location of a hidden base. But the transmission was intercepted by a Royal Navy listening post on the northern coast of Scotland. The signal was recorded, time-stamped, and forwarded to Bletchley Park, the nerve center of Allied cryptographic operations. At Bletchley, the message was decrypted within hours. The codebreakers of Hut 8, working with the algorithms and insights developed by Alan Turing and his colleagues, had long since broken the naval Enigma cipher. By 1943, the Allies were reading German naval communications in near real time. But this particular message caught the attention of a traffic analyst named Margaret Harding. Harding was not a mathematician. She was a librarian before the war, recruited into intelligence work because of her ability to recognize patterns in large volumes of data. Her job was not to decrypt messages, but to analyze them, to track the flow of communications, identify networks of transmitters and receivers, and map the relationships between different units and commands. When she saw the weather report from U-632, she noticed something odd. The call sign deviation, small as it was, suggested that the transmission had originated not from the submarine's usual operator, but from a different source. Cross-referencing the signal with direction-finding data, Harding determined that the transmission had come from a location far to the west of where U-632 was believed to be operating. The discrepancy was small, but significant. It suggested that there was another transmitter in the network, one that had not been previously identified. Harding brought the anomaly to the attention of her supervisor, who escalated it to the operational intelligence staff. Within days, a team of analysts was assigned to investigate. They pulled every intercepted transmission that matched the frequency and encryption protocol used by U-632. They analyzed call signs, transmission times, signal strength, and direction-finding bearings, and slowly, painstakingly, they began to construct a map. What they found was startling. The traffic analysis revealed the existence of a previously unknown node in the German weather intelligence network. The node was transmitting on a regular schedule, using a disguised call sign, but the encryption was identical to that used by German naval weather stations. More importantly, the direction-finding bearings placed the source of the transmissions not in the Arctic, but somewhere on the coast of Labrador. The Allies had discovered weather station Kurt, but they did not yet know what it was, where exactly it was located, or how it had come to be there. What they did know was that the Germans had somehow managed to establish a covert installation on North American soil, and that it was actively feeding intelligence to the U-boat fleet. The strategic implications were profound. If the Germans could place a weather station in Labrador, what else might they have placed there? Were there other installations, fuel depots, observation posts? The possibility that enemy forces were operating undetected on Allied territory was unacceptable. A decision was made to locate and neutralize the station. The task fell to the Royal Canadian Navy. In late March 1943, a naval task force was assembled in Halifax, Nova Scotia. It consisted of 2 corvettes, a minesweeper, and a detachment of Canadian commandos trained in Arctic warfare. The operation was classified as top secret. The crews were not told the nature of their target, only that they were to conduct a sweep of the Labrador coast in search of enemy installations. The weather was atrocious. Storms battered the convoy as it steamed north, the ships pitching and rolling in seas that towered 30 feet above the deck. Ice floes scraped against the hulls. Visibility was measured in yards. The men lived in a state of constant discomfort, wet, cold, exhausted. It took them a week to reach the search area. The sweep began on April 2nd. The ships moved slowly along the coastline, stopping at every bay and inlet, sending landing parties ashore to search for any sign of human activity. The terrain was brutal. Jagged rocks, freezing winds, terrain that tore at boots and clothing. The commandos moved in pairs, searching methodically, finding nothing. Days passed. The cold became unbearable. Frostbite casualties mounted. The operation began to seem futile, a wild goose chase driven by faulty intelligence. And then, on the morning of April 11th, a patrol discovered something, a set of footprints in the snow, leading up from the beach. The prints were old, weathered by wind and ice, but unmistakable. Someone had been there. The commandos followed the tracks to a low ridge overlooking Martin Bay. There, half buried in snow and camouflaged with rocks, they found Weather Station Kurt. The station was intact, but inoperative. The batteries had died weeks earlier, the cold having drained them faster than the German engineers had anticipated. The equipment was still in place. The barometers, the anemometers, the radio transmitters, all meticulously arranged and connected. The canisters, marked with the counterfeit Canadian Weather Service labels, lay scattered nearby. The commandos photographed everything, catalogued the equipment, and reported their findings back to command. The discovery was a sensation. For the first time in the war, the Allies had physical proof that German forces had operated on North American soil. The equipment was dismantled and transported back to Halifax for analysis. Intelligence officers pored over the components, tracing serial numbers, identifying manufacturers, reconstructing the timeline of the station's deployment. What they learned was both impressive and unsettling. The station had been designed to operate autonomously for up to 6 months. It was powered by dry cell batteries, robust enough to function in sub-zero temperatures. The transmitters were state-of-the-art, capable of broadcasting on multiple frequencies, disguised to mimic Allied meteorological services. The entire installation, from conception to deployment, represented a level of planning and technical sophistication that exceeded what Allied intelligence had believed the Germans capable of achieving in covert operations. But more importantly, the discovery of Weather Station Kurt confirmed what the traffic analysts at Bletchley Park had suspected. The German weather intelligence network was far more extensive and far more resilient than the Allies had realized. If the Germans were willing to go to such lengths, to send a submarine across the Atlantic, to risk an installation on enemy soil, it meant that weather data was not merely important to their operations, it was essential. The story of Weather Station Kurt might have ended there, a footnote in the history of covert operations, a curiosity overshadowed by larger battles and greater losses. But the discovery had consequences that rippled far beyond the rocky shores of Martin Bay. The intelligence, gleaned from the captured equipment, allowed Allied cryptographers to refine their understanding of German communication protocols. It provided insight into the structure and vulnerabilities of the weather intelligence network, and it prompted a systematic effort to locate and destroy other covert German installations across the Arctic. In the months that followed, Allied aircraft and naval forces swept the northern archipelagos, targeting suspected weather stations with bombs and naval gunfire. Several installations were destroyed. Others, the men who served aboard U-632, never knew the consequences of their mistake. The submarine was sunk on April 6, 1943, depth charged by a British destroyer south of Iceland. All hands were lost. The wreck was never found. Captain Lieutenant Hans Karpf, who had stood in the control room clutching that folded weather report, went down with his boat, along with 45 others. They were young men, most of them, barely out of their teens. They had believed in the invincibility of their technology, in the security of their codes, in the righteousness of their cause. They had been taught that the Enigma cipher was unbreakable, that their transmissions were invisible to the enemy, that they operated in a realm of secrecy that no adversary could penetrate. They were wrong. The war had taught them, in the end, the same lesson it taught every combatant, that no system is perfect, that no secret remains hidden forever, that the margin between victory and defeat is often measured not in grand strategies or decisive battles, but in the smallest of errors, the tiniest of mistakes, the human frailties that no amount of engineering or discipline can entirely eliminate. The discovery of Weather Station Kurt was not a turning point in the war. It did not win a battle or save a convoy, but it was a symbol, a tangible representation of a larger truth that defined the conflict, that war in the 20th century was as much a contest of information as it was of firepower, that intelligence and deception were weapons as potent as bombs and bullets, and that the side which could see the battlefield most clearly, which could read the enemy's intentions, predict their movements, and deny them the same advantage would ultimately prevail. The weather station itself, after being studied and catalogued by Allied intelligence, was quietly dismantled. The components were crated and shipped to various research institutions. Some ended up in university laboratories, used to train a new generation of meteorologists. Others were stored in warehouse archives, forgotten relics of a secret war. For decades, the existence of Weather Station Kurt remained classified. The Canadian government, wary of public alarm over the fact that enemy forces had operated on its soil, chose not to publicize the discovery. The few men who knew the full story, the commandos who found the station, the intelligence officers who analyzed it, the cryptographers who traced its transmissions, kept their silence. The official records were sealed, and so the story faded into obscurity, known only to a handful of historians and intelligence specialists. It was not until 1977, more than 30 years after the war's end, that the truth finally emerged. A German naval historian, researching the logbooks of U-537, uncovered references to Operation Kurt and the deployment of the weather station. He published his findings in a small academic journal. The article caught the attention of Canadian researchers, who cross-referenced the account with their own wartime records. Slowly, painstakingly, the full story was reconstructed. In 1981, a team of archaeologists and historians traveled to Martin Bay to search for the site. They found remnants of the station still buried in the tundra, fragments of antennae, rusted battery casings, sections of cable half submerged in the permafrost. The artifacts were excavated and placed in a museum in Ottawa. A plaque was erected at the site, marking it as the only location in North America where German military forces operated during World War II. It stands there still, weathered by wind and time, a monument to a forgotten chapter of the war. But the true legacy of Weather Station Kurt lies not in the physical remnants of the installation, but in the lesson it teaches about the nature of secrecy and the fragility of covert operations. The station was, by every measure, a success. It was deployed without detection, operated as designed, and provided valuable intelligence to its creators. It should have remained hidden, its existence unknown, its data flowing undetected into the German command network for months or even years. That it was discovered at all was the result not of superior Allied surveillance or intelligence penetration, but of a mistake so small that the man who made it likely never realized he had done so. A procedural error, a three-character deviation, a moment of human fatigue translated into a pattern that traffic analysts could recognize, direction finders could trace, and cryptographers could exploit. It was, in the end, not the technology that failed, but the people who used it. And that, more than any lesson about ciphers or codes or covert operations, is what Weather Station Kurt reveals, that in war, as in all human endeavors, perfection is unattainable. Every system has flaws, every secret can be uncovered, every fortress, no matter how well defended, has a gate left unlocked, a wall left unguarded, a moment of inattention that an enemy can exploit. The men who designed and deployed Weather Station Kurt understood the risks. They knew that operating on enemy soil was an act of extraordinary audacity, that discovery would mean capture or death, that the margin for error was vanishingly small. They planned meticulously, they trained rigorously, they executed their mission with precision and discipline, and still, they were undone by a mistake they never made, a transmission they never sent, an error committed by a stranger hundreds of miles away who had no knowledge of their existence or their mission. There is a kind of poetry in that, a tragic symmetry that speaks to the randomness and interconnectedness of war. The radio operator aboard U-632, hunched over his transmitter in the stinking darkness of the submarine, could not have known that his fatigue would cost lives, that his lapse in protocol would lead Allied forces to a hidden installation on the far side of the Atlantic. He was simply doing his job, trying to survive, enduring the same crushing monotony and terror that every submariner faced. He was a man, not a machine, and men, no matter how well trained, make mistakes. The German High Command understood this. In the abstract, they knew that operational security was a fragile thing, that every transmission risked interception, that every movement risked detection, but they also had to believe that their technology, their training, their discipline, would be enough. They believed in the myth of the invincible cipher, in the illusion of perfect secrecy, and when that illusion shattered, when the Allies demonstrated that they could read Enigma, could track submarines, could find hidden weather stations in the Arctic wilderness, the psychological impact was devastating. It was not merely a loss of tactical advantage, it was a loss of confidence, a creeping realization that the enemy knew more than they should, that the veil of secrecy had been torn away, that the war was being fought not. And so, the discovery of Weather Station Kurt, minor as it might seem in the context of the vast and terrible war, mattered. It mattered because it confirmed to the Allies that their intelligence efforts were succeeding, that the enemy's secrets were not as secure as they believed. It mattered because it forced the Germans to question the reliability of their own systems, to divert resources to security and counterintelligence, to second-guess every transmission and every operation. It mattered because it was a tangible, physical manifestation of the intelligence war fought by analysts and codebreakers and traffic specialists who never saw the front lines, who never fired a weapon, who worked in obscurity and silence, and whose victories were measured not in territory gained or enemy killed, but in knowledge acquired, in patterns recognized, in secrets revealed. These were the unsung warriors of World War II, the men and women who sat in bunker rooms lit by fluorescent lights, who stared at intercepts and frequency charts and decryption sheets, who sifted through mountains of data in search of the one anomaly, the one mistake, the one thread that, when pulled, would unravel the enemy's plans. Their work was tedious, exhausting, and often seemingly futile. For every breakthrough there were 1,000 dead ends. For every decoded message there were dozens that remained impenetrable. But they persisted, driven by the knowledge that their work mattered, that the intelligence they produced saved lives, shortened the war, brought victory closer. They were not seeking glory, they were seeking clarity, and in the case of Weather Station Kurt, they found it. The story ends, as all stories from that war must end, with reflection on what was lost and what was won. The men who died aboard U-630, the crew of Weather Station Kurt, who survived the war only to live in obscurity, the Allied sailors who drowned in the cold Atlantic, they were all, in their own way, victims of the same machinery of violence and deception that consumed the world between 1939 and 1945. They fought for causes they believed in, or were told to believe in, or simply accepted because there was no alternative. They endured hardships that tested the limits of human endurance. They made mistakes, as all humans do, and they paid the price, as soldiers always have, with their lives, their health, their futures. But from their sacrifice, from the wreckage of their ambitions, and the failure of their plans, came a lesson that endures. It is a lesson about the limits of secrecy, about the impossibility of perfect control, about the ways in which even the smallest error can cascade into consequences that reshape history. It is a lesson about the power of information, and the people who wield it, and the unglamorous, relentless work of turning raw data into actionable intelligence. It is a lesson about the fragility of systems, and the resilience of the human capacity to adapt, to learn, to exploit weaknesses, to turn the enemy's strengths into vulnerabilities. And it is a lesson, finally, about the weather, that most mundane of subjects, discussed by strangers in elevators, cursed by farmers and sailors, reduced to symbols on a map. Weather, which shaped the outcome of battles, determined the fates of convoys, decided whether men would live or die. Weather, which the Germans sought to control through science and secrecy, and which the Allies learned to exploit through intelligence and persistence. Weather, which in the end remained what it had always been, indifferent, unpredictable, beyond the reach of any human ambition. The weather station on the shores of Martin Bay transmitted its last signal in February 1944. When the batteries finally died and the equipment fell silent, the snow covered it, the wind eroded it, the permafrost reclaimed it, and the war moved on, leaving it behind. a forgotten artifact of a secret campaign waged in the margins of the great conflict, known to no one, mourned by no one, remembered by no one, until decades later, when historians and archaeologists uncovered it and brought its story into the light. And in that story, we find not just the tale of a hidden base and the mistake that revealed it, but a mirror held up to the nature of war itself, vast and impersonal, yet shaped by the smallest human actions, driven by grand strategies, yet decided by individual failures, fought with the most advanced technology of the age, yet ultimately constrained by the limits of human frailty. Where the station Kurt stands, in memory if not in fact, as a monument to all of that, a monument to secrecy and its inevitable failure, a monument to the men who fought in the shadows, and a monument, above all, to the enduring truth that in war, as in life, it is often the smallest mistakes, the ones we never see coming, the ones we make without thinking, the ones that seem insignificant in the moment, that change everything.